The movie title, Children of Men, actually references a Bible verse, which says, "Thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, Return ye children of men." What does this mean, and why is this the title for a story about the human race becoming infertile? We're talking about that and more this week in Kaden's Movie Club. Children of Men was co-written and directed by Alfonso Cuarón, who also directed Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Remember how the tone went from this to this?
I'm Harry Potter.
You can thank this guy. Also, if the plot of this movie ever reminded you of The Last of Us, that's no coincidence. The creator of the game was heavily inspired by this story. The movie is based on a book by P.D. James. She described her book as a Christian fable, but the director, Cuarón, described his movie as a look at Christianity. Now, just to be clear, this isn't a Sunday school lesson, but I did want to address the context behind the themes. Most interpretations of the phrase, "Return ye children of men," believe it's pointing out the frailty of human life. But I looked at an Oxford Bible commentary that said the scripture, quote, "is best viewed as a community petition complaining that God's wrath has lasted beyond a normal human lifespan and asking how much longer this unhappy state will continue." Now, I think it's worth reiterating here that Cuarón said he was okay with spiritual archetypes in the movie, but didn't want to deal with dogma. I read that as, I'm fine with spiritual themes and commentary about religion, but I'm not preaching at anybody. So what do we make of all this when it comes to the story? The world is immediately introduced as a dark, depressing place. We know that the human race has become infertile. People have all kinds of theories, both scientific and spiritual, but nobody really knows why, and we never find out either. A lot of stories use this kind of approach where something mysterious has caused a set of circumstances, but the mystery itself is irrelevant. Another great example would be the TV series The Leftovers, where 2% of the world's population suddenly disappears and nobody knows why. And that's because the storyteller isn't actually interested in the logistics. They're interested in how humans would react to a drastic situation in which there are no answers. How do they make sense of it? What do they do in the aftermath? Which of course relates to our theme of post-apocalyptic stories. The so-called apocalypse may not always be the things we think of, like zombies or nuclear fallout. It could be any event that puts characters into this kind of situation where tragedy alters life in a permanent way. These stories serve as a great parallel to real life because even though a lot of the tragedies we witness do have explanations, there's often no answer that actually satisfies the question of why do bad things happen? Especially for people who choose to believe in God. Why would God let bad things happen? These stories explore some of those ideas by providing a tragic scenario in which there is no answer. And the characters in the story represent different ways in which people respond to those circumstances. So let's look at Theo. At the beginning, he's closed himself off to the world. Everyone around him is reacting emotionally to the loss of the youngest person in the world, and Theo doesn't care. He's given up the fight for hope and optimism. Then there's Theo's cousin, the wealthy art collector. Theo points out, in 100 years, there won't be anyone around to appreciate all of this stuff you've collected. How do you do it? And the cousin says, I just don't think about it. The cousin has chosen to ignore the problem and has the ability to do that through his wealth. But for most people, the world has become a place where violence and cruelty is just common. According to this story, when people don't have a future generation to leave the world to, they let that world decay. But then the story introduces hope back in through a miracle. It's also unexplained, but a young woman named Key is miraculously pregnant. And this would be one of those spiritual archetypes that the director mentioned. And just to make sure we're on the same page, an archetype is like a recurring symbol or idea. Something we see over and over again in literature and art. The idea of a miraculous birth probably feels familiar to some of us because, in Christian theology, Jesus has a miraculous birth. And in that theology, that event represents spiritual salvation. Meanwhile, Key and her miraculous pregnancy represent literal salvation for the human race. A central question is presented throughout the movie and literally described by Jasper, the debate between faith and chance. I think we could also use the synonyms hope and nihilism. The idea that life has a purpose and it has meaning versus the idea that everything is random and nothing matters. We can see how that debate ties back into the idea we got from the title. People are constantly faced with difficult times and tragic events, and the inner battle to choose between hope or nihilism can get really difficult. It's what would motivate an ancient author to write a poem in which they ask God how long he is going to keep punishing them. And we actually get an ongoing metaphor for that in the movie through the sound design. In the first scene of the movie, Theo is near an explosion that creates a ringing in his ears. When he meets with the character Julian, she explains,
"You know that ringing in your ears? That ee? That's the sound of the ear cells dying, like their swan song."
And we hear that ringing come back several times throughout the movie, essentially anytime Theo lives through yet another tragic experience. So every time, something is dying inside of him. And it's not just his ear cells, it's his hope. But that sound is replaced in a few key scenes toward the end of the movie. Take the moment where Theo and Key are able to walk through a chaotic firefight because everyone stops to look at the newborn baby. The sound is no longer a ringing. It's still a high-pitched noise, but a completely opposite sound. It's a human singing in a kind of angelic way. And this happens again when they're in the boat at the end. These moments, in contrast to the ones with the ringing, are building Theo's hope again. To me, this is reflective of that ongoing battle. There will be moments that restore our faith in humanity and the world, and moments which do the opposite. The question is, where do we end up? Maybe it's different depending on the day, but where does the movie end up in terms of sound design? credits roll to the sounds of children. It ends on a hopeful note. There's so much more to analyze in this movie, I just scratched the surface. So please share any thoughts or observations you might have had. We'll chat about it in the comments. But before we wrap up, I'd like to give a sneak peek on next week's movie, I Am Legend. I Am Legend is based on a book written in 1954 by Richard Matheson. It's been adapted into a movie twice before I Am Legend as The Last Man on Earth and The Omega Man. In the book, the infected people are referred to not as zombies, but as vampires. The reason for this is because the whole story is actually a twist on the idea of Dracula. We have all these legends about Dracula in which he terrorizes humans, but what if that idea was flipped? We view Dracula as a monster, but what if he felt like he was surrounded by an endless horde of monsters, us? Which is where the title comes from, I Am Legend. Spoiler alert here if you haven't seen it yet, but there's that scene at the end of the movie where Anna gives this monologue about how Robert Neville gave his life so humanity could have a cure.
We are his legacy. This is his legend.
I gotta tell you, that's nonsense. It's also not the real ending to the movie. Yes, that is the ending that was shown in theaters and on most DVDs, but it was not the original ending, and my guess, not the ending that the writers wanted. Ideally for this week, we'd all be watching what's called the alternate cut of I Am Legend. Unfortunately, the alternate cut is not streaming anywhere. I just happen to have a DVD that lets you watch the alternate version that I bought specifically for that purpose. However, you can view the alternate ending on YouTube, and I highly recommend doing so because it's going to be a big part of our discussion. And this week, there's only one question that I'm going to suggest you keep in mind while watching. What kind of legend is Robert Neville? I'll see you next week, and if you want to be an official part of Movie Club, you know where to go.